Thank you. The next item is the site assessment report on town-owned land identified for possible affordable housing use. The purpose of this agenda item is for the town council to receive a report from Summit Design and Engineering Services on the site assessment of identified town-owned land for possible affordable housing use. William Wirt, the project manager at Summit Design and Engineering Services, is here to give an overview of the report, and Anne Marie is here as well for any questions or feedback. Mr. Wirt.
Welcome and thank you for your patience.
You. I do have a presentation.
So Mr. Wirt,
Wirt.
W-O-R-T?
W-I-R-T.
W-I-R-T, Wirt. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Let me do the, all right. And if you want to move it, you can do it by the arrows right here.
Okay. Thank you. All right, good evening. My name is William Wirt. I'm the project manager with Summit Design and Engineering, who oversaw the due diligence report for the two properties in question, Pathway Drive, as we'll call it here, and Crest Street. We also worked with Three Oaks Engineering, who did some environmental assessment excuse me, on identifying streams, endangered species and habitats, and some buffer regulations as well, which I'll discuss here tonight. I'll just say from the outset here, a due diligence report, and forgive me if I'm telling you things you already know, is simply a report to for a developer or an owner to build off of, to decide what kind of development they're going to do, and to decide if they're going to do anything on the land at all. So that was the purpose of this report, which covered four things, four categories: an existing conditions survey and a tree survey, which covered topography, existing buffers, easements, and encroachments, and the tree inventory. So the existing conditions survey is exactly that. It's just supposed to convey what is existing on the site. It's not necessarily used for platting purposes or as an ALTA. It's not necessarily legal, but it's used as a starting point to begin site design and site analysis. The geotechnical report, points of focus were analysis of existing soils and groundwater conditions, depth of rock, which there is a lot on both sites, recommendations for the foundations you'll need, the type of subgrade treatment that you'll have to perform if you decide to build here, and then pavement design as well. And the last two are the environmental reports. Phase 1 environmental site assessment and ESA, the wetland, stream, and buffer delineation, and the protected species habitat assessments and surveys. Those last two items there is what Three Oaks provided. And then the preliminary stormwater impact analysis is what we call the SIA. That basically reviews stormwater management requirements as set forth by Carborough. Since Carborough is the authority having jurisdiction, you might see the abbreviation AHJ in the presentation. It also presented stormwater control measures. As some citizens pointed out, we did not design stormwater control measures. We only listed ones that would be effective for this site if you chose to develop. And then low impact development was another point of emphasis. We were asked to look at low impact development. Is exactly what it sounds like. How do you specify requirements for the development you're proposing so that you have a lower impact on things like stormwater runoff, groundwater, affecting groundwater, tearing down trees, and clearing the site? So I'll start with the survey. I think you know the subject site Pathway Drive pretty well. So it's really made up of 3 properties. The first one is bisected by Pathway Drive, the one to the east side right here, and then the one most north, which is bisected by a perennial stream and is buffered. You have some easements, sewer easements on there, and they're all zoned some form of residential. And then the Crest Street site was down at the end of Crest Street and is a single property, also bisected by a stream and covered with easements. So the topography, like people have said, for both sites, we'll start with Pathway, is steep. It's about 11%, and that is what I would call like a median slope across the site. So in the areas that you're probably going to build in, if you chose to do so, you'd be dealing with an 11% slope with grading, with cutting that down, put your buildings on, put your roads in. Everything flows towards the stream. We go back real quick. There it is. Everything goes towards the stream. Even most of this topography here, which really slopes off into neighbors' properties in development, you would end up directing all of that way. Crest Drive is pretty much the exact same situation. It's smaller. You have a much shorter flow path across your site to get to your stream, which eventually carries all the runoff off your site. So you have an even steeper slope, about 12% in the main area where you would build. We'll discuss buildable area in the stormwater report. So we also look at, with existing condition surveys, what type of restrictions are on your property. The biggest ones are buffers and easements. On the subject sites, you got water and sewer easements. There's one combined, meaning there are water and sewer together. And then stream buffer, which was pulled from the town of Carborough's GIS, lists Zone 1 and Zone 2 as 30 feet. And then in the environmental investigation, since those have been recorded on GIS, have actually been updated to be much wider than 30 feet. So those would need to be updated into development plans during your permitting process if you chose to move forward. You've got some tree houses on Pathway, some fences, and some driveways that encroach. That's obviously an owner decision on how you want to deal with those. The sewer easement here on Pathway, where you're looking just north of Pathway, is highlighted in yellow there. It looks like you have the majority of the easement on your site. You've got a little bit that comes onto these neighbors' that encroaches onto these neighbors' properties here. You've got existing tree houses that were picked up and a fence line going up. So we rotated the map so we could see it a little bit more. So north is this way. Still on the Pathway Drive site. Here at your creek, you've got another sewer easement running along your creek, which is typical. You gravity your sewer, and so typically sewer outfalls are located close to streams. You'll also see here buffers. Here's your Zone 2 buffer is 30 feet as defined by Carborough's GIS. Zone 1 is 30 feet. And then you have ephemeral streams here, which we'll talk about shortly, and those are buffered as well as Zone 2. Zone 1 and Zone 2 have different restrictions based on the AHJ, Carborough, or if there's a watershed restriction like Jordan Lake's watershed, restrictions on what you're allowed to build in zones. You might be able to encroach on Zone 2 with fill slopes, and you might not be able to touch Zone 1s at all, just depending on the regulations that are set in place at that site. Crest Street, again, sewer easements, water line easements, encroachments, and buffers. The tree survey was provided to count the trees. All of the trees that qualified were large caliper trees, typically like 12 inches in diameter or bigger. They are identified so that the developer can understand the impact of clear cutting the site, what kind of species you'd be taking down, and depending on your land architecture requirements, what kind of species you might have to put back in development. Pathway Drive has 312 that qualify as such trees, and Crest Street has 46. Okay, so soil conditions, your geotech summary here. You're located in what's called the Slate Belt in North Carolina. You have a lot of rock on this site, volcanic and igneous rock. Weathered rock is a subcategory of that, which is located a little bit higher towards the surface, typically, and is starting to break down and become soil. It's still hard to rip out of the ground. Bedrock is even harder. We found weathered rock at 5 borings, bedrock at 3 borings, and groundwater was found at 1 boring on Crest Street at about 3 feet deep. And you can expect to find groundwater higher in the soil strata as you get closer to streams. The geotech report listed that the soil conditions of the site are suitable to development. So I'll just take a minute here to clarify that. They mean suitable for development, or we mean suitable for development in the tight scope of geotechnical analysis, meaning you can build on this material on your site. There's nothing that is particularly restrictive. No super high groundwater. Rock is good to build on because it's stable and your foundations won't sink. So from a geotechnical perspective, it's suitable for development. The recommendations were listed. Foundations, the top 2 there, spread footings and continuous wall footings, are typical of what you'd find on like a single family home, maybe some townhomes. Monolithic slabs and turn down footings can also be found on those. Think like slab on grade houses and things like that. If you don't have a design, structural design for your maximum load, the building code defers to 2,000 pounds per square foot. So that what's found on site is suitable for that bearing load. And then if in the case where you decided to develop, you would go in and do further geotechnical investigation, as some people have pointed out. And then if the structural engineer provides load capacities, that bearing pressure could go up. Controlled fills are good. CL, ML, the SM, those are all types of soils. Clay and silts and sandy silts, which are good to build on. And then density requirements for putting those in are all 95 to 98% compaction. All right, environmental reports and summary. So the phase 1 ESA is performed per the standards set forth by the American Standards for Testing Materials, ASTM. And so all of the findings in this report are based off of the standards set forth there. These reports are done to identify REC. That's hazardous substance. Usually that means something related to petroleum, something that is on site, something that is likely to be on site, or something that has potential for future release on site. No environmental concerns were identified as part of these sites, and no significant data gaps were identified either, meaning like all of the records kept on this site as far as environmental assessments go have been continuous through the years as it's been sold or as it's been looked at for development.
Mr. Work, could I pause you there? So
Yes.
would it be a fair summary to say that the ESA Phase 1 report, what you're basically saying is you're confident that nobody dumped petroleum products on the site and that those records could not have gone unfound had someone done that? Is that sort of a general?
Correct. Yeah, based on the standards set forth by the ASTM.
I just want to be clear about like what that scope is not. When you're talking about environmental hazards, you're talking about a specific kind of environmental hazard and data about it,
Yes.
rather than maybe the broader common use of the term environmental hazard.
Right. You could think like dumping hazardous material on site. Okay, so Three Oaks Engineering goes out and does an environmental assessment. We work with them all the time. They do stream evaluation and they do species evaluation. The ones you've got here, tricolored bat. You've got NLEB, another type, and then Atlantic pigtoe, I believe is a fish or a mussel.
I had to look it up. It's a mussel.
Yeah, a mussel. And then the bald eagle. All of these are listed in data banks that the state keeps up with as potential impact animals. So they keep an eye out for these particular species when they go to look for habitats and when they go to look for those creatures actually on site. The ones that are present are forested roosting and forested roosting for the bats. So basically there's evidence that bats are roosting on site. So if you find that in a development and you want to develop the site, there's a specific period of time during the year that you're allowed to clear, because eventually the bats will leave for a season and then you're allowed to clear there. Or there will be some other type of regulation that puts restriction on the clearing type. Perhaps you're only allowed to clear 30% of the site, as an example. They also found the buffers here. This is pretty dense, but all channels are within the Jordan Lake watershed and outside University Lake, which is a really restrictive watershed to build in. You've got perennial UT, that's unnamed tributary. That's your stream right here, your big one on Pathway Drive. Perennial means your big streams. It's always got water running through it, except in cases of extreme drought or if someone develops upstream and moves it. Based on the perennial classification, you'll have 50-foot zone 1 and 50-foot zone 2 buffers. And then on your ephemeral streams, which could be effectively a ditch if it's dry, it could be a spring it could be a ditch downstream of a spring location. And obviously, as you've seen in those videos, during heavy rains, those are typically the channels that flow is rushing through, is your ephemeral streams. Those get 15-foot buffers.
Mr. Wirt, one more question here.
Yes.
You mentioned earlier a discrepancy where the GIS showed 30-foot buffers.
Yes.
So for a diagram like this, are you showing the 30-foot or the 50? In other words, if we're looking at the diagrams where you're showing buffers, are those the 30-foot buffers being shown that are in the GIS? And we should imagine those being extended by an additional 40 feet in order to comply with our regulations?
Correct. So likely what happened, this isn't necessarily exactly what happened, but someone looked at developing this site sometime in the past, and Carborough's code said every perennial stream gets a 60-foot buffer total. You have 2 zones, they're 30 feet. Now, since that standard has been updated, since all of the surrounding neighborhoods has been developed, the buffers have increased to 50 foot aside. So when you go to develop, if you choose to do so, you have to follow the 50-foot regulation, not the 30-foot regulation. But the surveyor, who is making an existing condition survey, can only rely on the GIS data that is existing at this time. Last note on this one is permitting. Like I touched on a little bit, if you're going to develop into zones and impact them, you got to get permitted. 2 major permits are your 404 through the Army Corps of Engineers And your 401, that's from NCDEQ, the Water Resources Division. Excuse me. And those permits have the allowable uses into buffers. So one allowable use is a perpendicular crossing to the stream. So if you wanted to put in a road across the stream to develop up here, you would have to go through state and federal permitting to do so on this stream.
Well, I have a question about the springs. Do any of the maps, I didn't know if any of the maps reflect where streams, the springs daylight into and feed the stream or streams.
I don't.
Several springs.
Yes, ma'am. I don't believe that the report identified springs as a classification. That could be for any number of reasons. One, because it's not required by typical analysis practices, or two, they're dry, which is likely what happened when we went out to evaluate these. But the signs of ephemeral streams could indicate springs upstream or any number of other issues upstream, as I mentioned before.
Well, we know in rain events that the springs daylight.
Right.
We do know that, and there's evidence from the videos.
Right, and there is supporting evidence with the groundwater elevation that we found on site as well. So when it rains a lot, the ground fills up with water. It's going to spout out right at those. Typically, I mean, obviously at the head of the ephemeral stream locations
Right.
found here. And then there were a lot here on Crest Street. And then you've got your buffers over here. You also have an existing wetland. Wetlands in this case aren't necessarily what you think they are. They don't have water in them all the time. It's a little bit more of a hydric soil classification, meaning that there's evidence that water has been there if it's dry or is deep in the soil. And those get buffers as well. So they get a 50-foot buffer. If they touch the edge of your buffer here, this is your zone 1 buffer, then the stream gets or the wetland gets a zone 1 buffer, and it gets a zone 2 buffer way out here. But that leaves the subject property.
Is the rock underneath Crest this is the same as, I know it's all part of the slate belt, but does it follow the same? Because I know it's downslope, so.
Yes, ma'am.
Mr. Ward, quick question here about the report said that groundwater was found in a borehole on the Crest Street site. Do you happen to know sort of where that particular bore where the groundwater was found was located?
Yes, I do. It's roughly right in the middle. It's right in the middle of the larger section here. I did not include that in this presentation, but it is in the geotech report. It's boring C3, I believe, which is right in the middle of that larger rectangular section.
Thank you. And a quick follow-up question on this one. Let me see if I understand this. Do we have the same issue with the width of buffers here? Or is this image showing the 50-foot buffer?
This image is showing the 50-foot buffer. You do have the same issue, though. 30-foot buffers were recorded on GIS.
Thank you.
Okay, the SIA summary. So, covering the stormwater management requirements, we'll start with Pathway Drive. Pre- and post-development runoff and volume match. Basically, as some people have brought up, they didn't see post-development numbers in the SIA. That's for two reasons. One is because in order to do post-development analysis, you have to have a concept plan at least, and that was not part of this scope, and we were not provided one by the town. In any case, however, you have to match your pre-development flows and your pre-development volume. So whatever was identified as pre-development flow, which we'll look at it in a second on each of these sites, has to be matched or reduced in post-development. Up to the 25-year storm design. There was some mention about 100-year. Again, that's a Carborough regulation. Any development is subject to the rules of the AHJ, so 25-year is the limit. We considered on-site and off-site drainage areas, which we'll look at in a second, and on Pathway Drive, we defined a buildable area, which we showed as the red hatched area here, and south of Pathway Drive here. We considered buildable area for a couple of reasons on Pathway Drive. One is because you have a large area that is unencumbered by easements or stream buffers. You have one ephemeral, or you have two ephemerals that you're touching. Those are much more easy to impact from a permitting standpoint. And, excuse me, it was to achieve a conservative design in the due diligence analysis. So, for example, in reality, based on your zoning, which we didn't investigate too much because zoning would be linked to a concept plan. We were not, again, that was not part of this scope. But let's call buildable area anywhere you're putting a house or you're grading or you're putting a road or parking lot. It's not necessarily impervious area, meaning it's not necessarily asphalt or roofs or buildings, but for the purposes of this analysis, we considered it as such. In reality, there may not be buffer requirements between properties that are zoned the same, but you can go in there and clear and then replant the buffer if you chose to do so, again, based on the zoning regulations of the authority. And then we stayed out of the easement over here because you can't develop in a sewer easement. Then we looked at some dimensions, some typical right-of-way dimensions and road width dimensions, and found that if it was so desirable, without considering topography and again being conservative in our analysis, you could connect this larger parcel here, or this larger buildable area here, excuse me, down to a smaller one to increase density. Again, density is a choice of the developer. It's not something that we were given, and it's not something that the zoning requirements necessarily specify. Sometimes they do, sometimes they don't. So you've got pre-development. We run all sorts of calculations and analysis to come up with these basic numbers. I'll try to go through them quickly. Total area is self-explanatory. Between the three parcels, you got about 13 acres. Your composite curve number, that's a number that we assign based on your ground cover conditions in pre-development. Because you have a lot of rock and your soil types, that's what's considered bad hydrologic soils, meaning there's not a whole lot, as evidenced by those videos, there's not a whole lot of infiltration naturally going on right now. So 70 is really pretty high. It's out of 100. Once you go into post-development, excuse me, we considered post-development based on the drainage area maps. Post 1A is the buildable area that we're talking about here. We consider we have a total area of the buildable area, or excuse me, it's 1A is a drainage area. The total area is 6.06. The buildable area within there is 3.15. And then the area to remain forested or to remain as pervious is 2.1 or 2.91. That comes to a curve number of about 85. Your time of concentration is how long it takes your flow to get from the highest point of your drainage area down to your lowest drainage area. So in those videos, you're at a low point in your drainage area. You're seeing the maximum runoff from a very large drainage area. And then for the 1 through 25-year storms, which are the storms you have to reduce between pre and post development or match, are provided here. So your peak runoff for the 1 year flow is about 7.5. You produce about 32,400 cubic feet of volume of water in the pre-development condition. That's for a 1-year storm. The videos that have been shared, that rainfall data indicated there's somewhere between a 10 and 25-year storm, probably on the upper end of that range. Your flows are much higher, and so is your volume, obviously. We'll talk about in a minute how you can reduce runoff, obviously, but then also reducing volume by putting it back into the soil. Crest Street, largely the same deal, but because of all the buffers that impact the area of the Crest Street site, we didn't define as much of a buildable area here. We just assumed 24%. That's going to be pretty conservative as it is, given the restrictions of permitting in buffers and the topography. That is a conservative assumption. So here is the Crest Street site. For example, you have all of your, So your Crest Street site is down here. We've got all our buffers in colored hatches here. And then all of your drainage area is defined by a point of analysis, which is low on your site. And you go up there reading the contours, how far off the site based off the contour analysis is what you're analyzing in pre versus post development. Again, Crest Street's numbers come back largely the same. Time of concentration pre-development's really high. In post-development, it's really low. And your runoff and your volume numbers are provided there as well. So water quality, all of Carborough is the authority having jurisdiction. Now, if this were to go to full permitting, because Carborough is also the owner of the site, you might not review it yourselves, meaning your staff might not be able to review it. So the state might review it. However, the state's still going to look at Carborough's land use ordinance. Article 16 covers most of the stormwater requirements, which require 85% total suspended solids removal, and then nutrient reduction as well, which is nitrogen, phosphorus. You're trying to keep those targets at the quantities listed there, and that's to reduce biological impacts to your streams. So all of your runoff is not only retained, it's also treated through those SEMs. So stormwater control measures. We identified 4 that would be useful here, and then gave you some pros and cons for them. Wet ponds, think of your typical pond. That's what a wet pond is. Large volume and runoff reduction. It's really good for handling that. It takes up a lot of space. So you have to reserve a lot of space to be able to build it. It takes a lot of grading, takes a lot of clearing. It is the least expensive option at scale of the rest of the SEMs identified. Bioretention can be any multitude of things. You can split them in cells across the site. It allows for improved infiltration because there's a component of bioretention for infiltration through an improved media in those devices. So instead of just controlling it, letting it sit, and then running it out through a pipe or structure, you're actually putting it back into the ground. And then, because you're on rock, for example, if it can't go into the existing ground, can't go through the media into the existing ground, it's put in pipes and then let out the structure. And with that infiltration, that can typically take like up to 72 hours. That's an option for greatly reducing volume and runoff. It's a low impact development option, which we'll talk about later. It's very effective as a treatment device. Underground storage is expensive. It reduces your visible impact on the site. It allows for the most density typically, because you're not reserving any surface area to construct it. It's all going underground. Depending on your target stormwater rates, these usually have to be really big, so they get to be really expensive. And then permeable pavers, which is one of the best low-impact development options. Think of a parking lot full of pavers, and then underneath the pavers is a large square section that runs the area of your parking lot or your road or what have you. And all of the water infiltrates through there and then does the exact same thing I just described with the bioretention. If it can't infiltrate into the existing soil, it gets picked up in pipes and released out very slowly over the course of 72 hours. Permeable pavers are good because what falls out of the sky is immediately going in, infiltrating into those. So the drawbacks for them is that they're also expensive. They're also difficult to maintain well. So, but if they are maintained well, which takes a lot of effort, then they're highly effective for volume reduction and for runoff reduction. And so the last thing we looked at was low impact development. Listing a few things quickly, obviously limiting your site clearing. That's a choice that the owner would make depending on density. If it was a private developer, they would want to maximize density because they want to maximize profit. Promoting tree conservation goes along with clearing. Bioretention, like we just talked about. Providing shared driveways instead of single driveways for each house to reduce impervious area. Relaxing setbacks. So if you can put houses closer up to property lines and up to roads, you have a smaller area to connect, to provide connection to those houses. Think reducing sidewalk infrastructure, driveway infrastructure. Undisturbed buffers, similar to the stream buffers, providing those along the property line. Permeable pavers, which we talked about. Disconnected impervious is basically, instead of putting all of your runoff into the ground, into pipes, you allow it to disperse over a large impervious area that's improved maybe with better infiltrating soil, lots of vegetation, so that it's not coming out concentrated at the end and washing out and scouring streams. Diffuse flow is that same concept. And then maintaining existing wetlands. If you have wetlands on site, keep them there. Those are natural stormwater control measures. And then rainwater harvesting is a green option for keeping your rainwater and using it for things that gray water is allowed to be used for, like irrigation and things like that. So basically, in conclusion, again, no concept plan was provided with this scope of work. The development, obviously, everything I just described is ultimately subject to the authority that's going to review it. If anything here is in violation of that authority is going to correct it and make us meet those particular standards. Think the buildable area is probably a lot higher than what's going to be feasible. So it was a conservative design approach. In reality, the AHJ is going to have concerns, and the review process will likely reduce items like that. And then all stormwater improvements will have to meet Carborough's land use ordinance, Article 6, and any state standards as well. Sometimes the municipalities defer to state design standards, particularly for SEMs. So anyway, we appreciate the opportunity to present this to the town, and I'm available for questions, obviously. And I believe that there will be a public engagement component to this as well to answer questions in the future as well. So,
Thank you, Ms. Swart.
yeah.
Council members, Councilmember Frey has had some questions. Anyone else? Our instructions are to receive the report, of course, and ask any clarifying questions about the report.
Madam Mayor, I think I got my questions in during the presentation. Thank you.
And this is, I think, pretty basic clarification here, and I suspect I have my answer. But when we talk in the context of this report for suitability, we're not necessarily talking about desirability from a subjective standpoint, which is to say, this is not really in the context of comparison to other regularly developed kinds of land. It's strictly a potentially doable assessment.
Correct. If the goal of the report is to offer no opinion, only the objective analysis of what it would take to build on the site. You could put a skyscraper on the site. You would obviously never do that. So, the goal was to have no opinion. So no desirability, like you say.
Thank you. Yeah, I think that's really just for some of the community conversation around the sort of concept of suitability identified here. But I appreciate that clarification.
Thank you. Councilmember Haven O'Donnell.
Yeah, thank you, William. So how, as a deliberative body, one of the things that we need to figure out is, what is the feasibility regarding the extensive engineering that it would take? You can engineer anything. I mean, we could put something on Mars. I mean,
Right.
so it's not a matter of can you engineer this. It's were it to be engineered, how with the obstacles that are at hand and the attendant, impacts to the surrounding neighborhoods. How would we go about assessing whether or not to invest in a concept plan? Because that's expensive. So, I'm trying to find out how do we get the kind of information that we need to know whether or not it's worth, going forward, given that we want to build affordable housing.
Right.
And we're not looking to, to do something that is going to be astronomically expensive.
Right. So let's pretend for a second that you're a private developer, and I'll just speak again, offering no opinion about the actual suitability of the site, but rather how you would do exactly as you asked, analyze it to see if you want to go forward with concept plans. Well, the main engineering components that in our line of work you would typically look at is, one, your grade across the site. So as a contractor or an owner, a developer, that's going to be really expensive to build on. You're either going to have to flatten it out, which means more than likely bring in a lot of fill, or you're going to have to put steeper roads in there, and all of your buildings are going to have to be on high foundations. You know that going in, just looking at the survey. Again, you have this sewer easement on the edge of your property, so that takes away from developable area. Streams are a huge pain. From a development standpoint, you have to permit them. You have to provide strict erosion control measures in construction, and then the inspection throughout construction for stream impacts, for buffer impacts, is pretty intensive. So those are some components you could look at by just seeing this survey and say, well, let's see if we bring in all this fill and flatten it out, how many townhome units we could get on for affordable housing. Or you might say, I don't want to fool with filling. I don't even want to look at it. I know it's going to be too expensive. I know I'm not going to get return on investment. Again, pretending you're a private developer here. I don't want the site. So those are some of the components and decision making, or some of the analysis you could do to decide whether you want to move forward with concept plans. Skipping back to our environmental maps here, your buffers, particularly on your Crest Street site, is ate up with buffers and ephemeral streams and large streams and easements. So you can't build on an easement, and you can't build over top of sewer, obviously. You're going to have to relocate if you want to maximize density. So those are things before you even start concept planning. And then the other thing I would add is what we see is sometimes projects go all the way through a concept plan all the way to what we call a pre-application meeting. So we go and meet with the authority and say, this is what we're thinking. Talk to us about the regulations here. What are we missing? What did we miss in the land development ordinance? And then sometimes it gets killed there after you've put in quite a bit of capital to investigate whether it's actually desirable to do.
I really appreciate it. I do appreciate, I mean, I went through the geotechnical, I'm going to go back through it. I mean, I happen to like that stuff, but it, you know, it's an extensive report. Is there any other information that we need regarding the what did you call it? Oaks Environmental?
Three Oaks.
Yeah.
Their report is a part of the report. Everything of the overall report, everything that they've provided is as detailed as it would need to be for anyone in the industry, I'll say, to make a decision. Meaning, like you have streams identified, you have buffers identified. Now you need to investigate what the permitting requirements for those are. So that's a starting point. And then another point I would add for the report overall is I believe staff is still looking at it. If they want to see corrections to the analysis based off their UDO, based off of Carborough's land development ordinance, then they can provide that to us. We typically have discussions, and we typically always make the corrections that they want to see.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. You had some.
Well, I think at this point, for me, there's like one sort of clarifying question, which is sort of next in our town process would be like a staff response to this report. Yes? Great. So I guess with that in mind, I think it's appropriate, given how much we've heard, to kind of just do a little orienting to where we are here, as we often do with this. We hear a lot of comments sort of about how could we find ourselves in this position to be considering this plot of land? I think, just kind of zooming out, and this is available on the town site, we find ourselves here after an intergovernmental task force between Chapel Hill and Orange County sort of prompted us to consider this tool of publicly owned land. And one of the reasons this is a really good tool for us is even as compared to possibly buying more suitable land, this obviously takes a tremendous amount of the expense of the acquisition off the top. I think, where we are here, we've heard some reference to the project or the development. There have been some very tentative back of the envelope numbers about possible units in absolutely preliminary discussions. But a project does not exist. A development does not exist. There is not a proposal for development concretely that we are considering or discussing. And I think what is appropriate to just take a moment to note is, for me personally, and this is where I'm going to take a little detour into speaking just for me personally, this is between two neighborhoods. So as I'm considering this as a layperson and as a council member, it strikes me as within the ballpark of possible findings from a report like this that we can deal with the slope. We can deal with the stormwater conditions as they exist. Possible retention measures might even improve the situation that residents are facing at the bottom of the hill. These seemed like findings that could potentially come back from this. What I am hearing individually is that we have some possible feasibility here, but real considerations about scale of efficacy if we were to consider this a meaningful intervention in our affordable housing supply. The expense of doing that, I think, we have real challenges on these plots of land that I think, for me, when we hear back from staff, what the conversation then becomes incumbent on us as a board is the tolerance for finding out our tolerance for these possible resource trade-offs. I'm hearing steep challenges. I'm hearing possible real roadblocks. I think it behooves us, just to continue to press on this a little bit. When I walked the parcel and I talked with Jane and Gretchen, and had a good visit, and Diane. one of the reasons we're here is we have so few possible resources in this conversation as a town. I don't think any of us really would, in a vacuum, identify this site, but our staff surveyed all of the land that we have. And getting to this point of this survey was the most reasonable course of action with the land that we have on hand, which is to say, last meeting, we received our community survey feedback. And, with a bullet, the number one thing we heard over and over and over again was affordable housing, need for affordable housing. Our possible interventions into this are very small in terms of meaningful scale and impact. I just sort of offer this to just assure everybody who's participated in this discussion that this has really been an open-ended exploration of, pretty limited and competing resources. As an individual council member who has been supportive of the idea of exploring this, I think it's not inappropriate to say that I think that this needs to prompt really serious conversations about whether this can be meaningful, but that we still have more process even before we would get to the point of even deciding whether we would want to proceed with a concept plan. So my anticipation is when we hear back from staff, there would be feasibility about the investment of a concept plan. There would be feasibility about the possibility of incorporating something this steep and wet and rocky into where we're headed with our LUO. I imagine we will hear some pretty big challenges about putting in units that would be a meaningful intervention in our affordable housing stock. And then I think it becomes incumbent upon us to decide, exactly how dear a price we want to pay for exactly what kind of return. I'm not in love with the fact that we would have to do a ton of environmental I guess what's the word, intervention to learn a ton more about the site. I think that's a steep challenge. All of which is to say, we are still pretty early in a process that does not have a defined endpoint, and that I think that this has been a tremendously valuable. I really appreciate your work, Will, and the entire Summit team. I think it has helped us have not a granular sense of a plan and expense, but a much more serious sense of, just what we're not able to do looking at a parcel of land, in terms of real understanding its relation to the building process. And so, I think I just kind of want to put the conversation as we potentially move forward from this agenda item around the idea that there is still, we're still in a very flexible phase of the process, and that what we are now reacting to is fact finding of like a pretty open-ended nature, and not really in relation to a particular project or concept, and that I think we all take pretty seriously the idea that we're going to have to weigh the investment in even reaching that point. So sorry to be a little long-winded, but I know that this has been an important issue, and I really want folks to understand how engaged we have been with it, and that I personally am with it, and how helpful this report has been in the discussion. So thank you very much, Will.
Mm-hmm. Thank you so much, Mayor Pro Tem. Now, Councilmember Frey.
Thank you, Madam Mayor. I just want to pull on a couple additional threads from what Mayor Pro Tem Nowell has said. One of those is for anybody following this process at home. These are the best town-owned lots we have for affordable housing. It does not make them good. It just makes them the best that we have. And that's now that we have some more granular information about the challenges that we are looking at, that tells us, where our next steps are. It is unfortunate that there is not, I'm looking at what somebody said, there is not an ample amount of flat land in Carrboro to purchase for this kind of project. There are points at which we may need to ask ourselves as a body, would we prefer to have a smaller number of affordable units or nothing on town-owned land? Because that is really what we are coming down to. It is not interchangeable with just go get more land elsewhere. I also think as a town, we're going to have to get really, really creative to make a dent in the affordable housing crisis that we have got. Let me see here. I think the other point that I wanted to draw on from that. No, you know what? I think that'll do it. I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Councilmember Frey. Anyone else? Merrill. We are early in this framework as we continue to explore. I feel like we're on like maybe step 3 or something like that. I mean, it's
2.5.
yeah, it's still really early. This is a very important piece of the framework. Mr. Word, I thank you for your work and also for your report. And I would like to just kind of see, where we can go next. That would come from our staff. And I was wondering, Anne Marie back there, I was wondering if Anne Marie could talk a little bit more about the next phase of staff review, since we now have this very full report from Summit and Three Oaks Engineering. Thank you, Anne Marie. Just so everyone knows, kind of where we are post report that I'm sure folks will continue to read through next couple of weeks.
Step 1 still.
Oh, it's still
Yeah.
even farther back. Okay.
Land has been identified,
Mm-hmm.
has been made, and as you all said, these are the best parcels that rose to the top for looking at for possible affordable housing use. And the due diligence report that we did, that is still step 1. Staff has not had a chance to go through it, so that is the next thing that we need to do, and we can do that over the summer and come back in the fall with a report. I'm sure that they will find things in there that we need to look at a little bit harder, and as the community and as you all go through the reports yourselves, I'm sure that you'll have more questions. So that's where we are. In the meantime, we'd like to do a public engagement piece with the community, with Scarborough residents, just to talk about this process that we've gone through, and since the report is out there, to take questions and just kind of talk that process through, and we'll see where we are in the fall, and hopefully have enough information by the fall to determine how you would like to proceed.
So would you do the staff review side by side with the public engagement, or would you do it post staff review, or what is staff thinking?
I think the planning can be concurrent, but
Okay.
I think the staff review can get started while it's still fresh.
Okay. That's all I have for Anne Marie. Anybody else? All right. Thank you, Anne Marie. Appreciate it. So we have received the report from Summit Design and Engineering, as well as what is it again? Three
Oaks Engineering.
3 Dog Night. It's late. And again, we thank you for the report and all the work that went into bringing this to us. And the report is received.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Council members have any other questions, correct? Yep. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.